very contextual, very contextual and relevant. And the topic is the forgotten marginal, recovering some gender and indigenous voices of freedom struggle, 1947. A little bit of introduction, Professor Dr. Dutta. Dr. Dutta's area of research interest include Indian nationalism, partition of India, migration, citizenship, and law. His approach is informed by the framework of subaltern school of school of history. He has authored 3 books and a number of articles in journals and national and international publications. It's a pleasure on my part, on the part of my institute, ICSSR-NERC, to have, I think, Dr. Binayak Dutta amongst us. And as I know, and as many of us know, he is a scholar and also is a scholar in making. And his insights on the history, particularly on partition, migration, citizenship, and I think in a broader context of the Northeast society is very valuable, very pertinent. So with this, I think few words, I warmly welcome you.
Thank you so much,
Dr. Dutta, to deliver your lecture. And now I think this whole session will be moderated by Professor Shillong, the head of the Department of History and the ex-dean School of Social Sciences. Madam, I also welcome you to this lecture session, and I'm thankful to you that you have kindly accepted my invitation to moderate this session. Although I understand, because I think we are just breaking for the vacation, and some of our colleagues have already left the university campus, native places. Some are maybe leaving today and tomorrow. So that's maybe one of the reasons that we have very less number of participation online for this program. Nevertheless, I think we will put the whole recording of this lecture in our website for wider viewing and circulation. So thank you once again, ma'am, for agreeing to my request to moderate this session. And now the floor is yours. Now you can invite Dr. Dutta to deliver his lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Panda. You've made my job much easier, and the very fact that we have somewhat thin attendance because of the reasons you've just stated, because today is the last working day, for all practical purposes. So people must be busy packing and things like that. For whatever reason, they haven't joined us, but you have decided to record this. So that's good enough. I think that will be made available to a wider audience. So without further ado, I'll ask Dr. Dutta to kindly deliver his talk on the Forgotten Marginal, recovering some gender and indigenous voices of the freedom struggle of 1947. Now, since we don't have much participation, you can take your time, but definitely not crossing an hour. Hopefully within 15 minutes maximum that you can complete your lecture. Please, ma'am, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you. At the very outset, I place on record my gratitude to ICSSR-NERC for giving me this opportunity to share a little bit of my interest on Indian freedom struggle. Ma'am, it's an honor to be in a session where you are chairing it. And basically, I'm really grateful to both you and Sir Panda. Ma'am, I want to essentially contextualize this theme that has been outlined for today's presentation, the Forgotten Marginal, Recovering Some Gender and Indigenous Voices of Freedom Struggle, 1947. Ma'am, the two crux words, and which I think is important for our cognizance here, is Forgotten Marginal and, of course, 1947. And the reason is that every time we talk about India's freedom movement, we are locating this lecture within the larger celebrations of 75 years of Indian independence, Azadi Ki Amrit Mahotsav. It's also pertinent to point out that it is also 75 years of Indian partition. And we need to probably also take on board the fact that it is within this discourse of independence and partition, the binary, and also the struggle that people actually raised, the struggle that people actually waged to fight against partition. Partition essentially was based on this negation of the idea of India, negation of this idea of composite culture, negation of this idea of a unified country. And so, I think I locate myself at this juncture where we need to incorporate the voices that struggled against partition within the larger discourse of Indian independence movement. I think, ma'am, to point this out, that every time we've spoken about Indian independence, we've kind of located ourselves between, say, 1757, where you talk about the Battle of Plassey, and say 1947, but oblivious of the processes of decolonization. This is as much a part of Indian independence as any other part. So if we are talking about Sepoy Mutiny on the one hand, we also need to talk about struggles against partition, the struggles to retain the unity of the country, the struggles to retain this unified community and geography. I think it's important because one of the most difficult aspects that we deal with when we are trying to talk about independence is that we often forget that when we are trying to conceptualize India, Northeast is a very, very important part of India. And the reason why I'm talking about Northeast today is, as I said, that Northeast is a marginal in the larger Indian, geographical, political, historical discourse. So every time we're talking about Indian history, very, very few references are there to Northeast history in the larger historical debates that are there in mainstream Indian textbooks. I'm sorry for using this word mainstream, but it's important to probably point out that very, very few references are there from Northeast in the larger history textbooks that we have in circulation. So the point that I'm trying to highlight at the very outset is that I locate this whole question of forgotten marginal, the idea of forgotten marginals by invoking the idea of Northeast India, because Northeast is undoubtedly history's forgotten marginals when we are trying to talk about Indian history per se. So when we are celebrating Azadi Ki Amrit Mahotsav, when we are trying to talk in terms of Indian independence, when we are trying to talk about Indian freedom struggle, we also need to incorporate Northeast India in a very, very big way. And in that context, I want to talk about Northeast. As I said, ma'am, that I flagged two issues here at the very outset. One, that I want to locate myself in the struggle against partition. I want to talk about a period which essentially is 1947-1948. And the reason why I go into 1948 is that there are a lot of spin-offs from 1947 partition that we deal with, but not so much insofar as discussing that in greater detail than what is needed. The second thing is, in the context of Northeast India, when we are trying to talk in terms of freedom, when we are trying to talk in terms of independence, I think it's important to also highlight that certain communities have not formed part of large-scale mainstream discourse. And here I'm definitely talking about women and indigenous communities. Long before today, sometime in the early 1980s, when the Subaltern Studies Collective launched its project, one of the things that it outlined was to invariably recover the voice of the marginals. In fact, it was the Subaltern Studies group that invariably spoke about trying to recover grassroots narratives. I want to locate my presentation within the Subaltern Studies perspective, the framework, by actually invoking what Gyan Pandey in his essay in defense of the fragment points out, that we need to recover the fragments of society. And in the larger historical discourse, in the discourse of Indian independence struggle, in the history of Indian independence struggle, I think it's important to recover the voices of the marginal. And in that sense, I want to recover the voice of women and indigenous communities. I'm not going to talk about all the women who participated, but I would definitely make a reference to the importance of individuals in history. Looking at the two different spectrums of history, if one were to actually go back to Carlyle, heroes and hero worship, we actually see how individuals, the study of individuals is important for understanding the larger developments of history, along with the other dimensions. We need to understand society, we need to understand culture, we need to understand politics, but we also need to understand individuals. And in that sense, I think it's important to talk about forgotten freedom fighters. The other side of the spectrum, we talk about Plekhanov, the role of individual in history, where Plekhanov also talks about how the larger understanding of society would remain vastly incomplete unless we also recovered the role of certain important individuals. And it is recognizing that across the spectrum, there seemed to be a certain unity of thought that while we understand society, while we understand the larger social, cultural, and political developments, we also need to look at individuals who played some kind of a vanguard role in the movements that we are going to study. So it is in that context, I try to identify three individuals. I choose, as I said, basically 1947, I choose the struggle against partition of the country as a site where I locate this freedom struggle, because I want to take it right up to 1947. A general impression is there that after Mountbatten agreed to partition India, the June 3rd Declaration 1947, which seemed to probably echo a unity of thought between the colonial state on the one hand and the mainstream political organizations, namely the Congress and the Muslim League on the other, that in the country India, as was constructed between 1757 and 1947, this idea of India should be partitioned between India and Pakistan. There seemed to be an understanding that it was almost like a fait accompli, and there were no questions asked. There were no resistance raised against this whole idea of partition. I want to probably very humbly suggest that when we are trying to talk about freedom struggle does not close till about 15th of August, 1947. And that is why the entire history of partition is as much a part of the freedom struggle as any other part. So if you're talking about 1857, I think it's also important to talk about the partition of the country and the struggle against partition. I want to also point out that there has been a large-scale reticence, and this is basically I'm invariably trying to locate myself in the context of all the three narratives that I'm going to share, that there seemed to be a reticence on the part of the dominant historical narrative to talk about violence. There seemed to be a reticence to talk about partition. And that the problem is because partition invariably, when the country was partitioned in 1947, it is, of course, in common knowledge that partition was accompanied by large-scale violence that started off between 1946 and continued till 1950. And these narratives that we are talking about, the three individuals that I have outlined, are invariably people who play their role in the context of the partition of the country and in the struggle against violence. I want to basically choose representative, individuals. Representative in the sense that I want to highlight one individual who represent my narrative of gender. I'm talking about a lady. Her name is Suhasini Das. And I'm talking about two indigenous communities in this narrative. The first are the Garo. One of the things that we invariably probably know, located in Meghalaya, that the three dominant communities, the Khasi, Jaintia, and Garo, invariably are also trans-border communities. And this is something that we probably often tend to not emphasize enough when we are trying to talk about our historical narratives, especially in terms of the histories of 1947 and beyond. The other part of it is that I'm also talking about the Chakma. Invariably, I'm talking about the Chakma because one of the things, ma'am, you would appreciate that the Chakma, though located in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, invariably share borders with two important northeastern states, namely Mizoram and Tripura. And invariably, when partition happened in 1947, one of the proposals that were there before 1947 was to make Chittagong Hill Tracts a part of the Indian Dominion, because it had 97 to 98% of the population as non-Muslim. In fact, an overwhelming 90% of the population are Buddhists. So in that sense, when we are starting to talk about this narrative, I think it's important to highlight these two communities and also locate myself in Assam insofar as the first narrative is concerned. Assam is a very, very interesting and a very curious case because in Assam, you actually see the play of partition in Northeast India. Because when we try and talk about partition, we invariably see that partition is located in mainstream discourses in the binary between Punjab and Bengal. I want to extend this narrative to a third site. And as I said, the third site is Northeast India. And in the context of Northeast India, I want to invariably locate it in the context of, say, the Khasi, the Garo, the Jaintia, and also slightly beyond where I start talking about the Chittagong Hill Tracts, the Chakmas sharing border with, or in that sense, locating themselves within the narrative of the Mizo, the narrative of Tripura. The first case is the case of Suhasini Das. Now, before getting into her role in the freedom struggle, may I just point out that Suhasini Das is one of the most renowned names in grassroots narratives, though there has been no official history that actually incorporates such names insofar as the history of the freedom struggle is concerned. We see that post 3rd June 1947, when Lord Mountbatten decided to partition India, he said that a referendum will be organized at Sylhet. Now here, when I'm talking about India, the other point that I want to emphasize is that till 1947, the geography that we deal with is undoubtedly a different geography. One should not be probably mixing up with the geography that we look at when we are talking about this, the map that we negotiate with post 1947. So therefore, invariably, when I talk about these people, they are as much part of the Garo, both in the hills and the plains, the Chakmas in Chittagong Hill Tracts, and people who are in South Assam invariably are also part of the larger Indian freedom struggle, are part of the larger Indian anti-colonial, anti-partition narrative. So let me start off by talking about Suhasini Das. But before I talk about Suhasini Das is a Gandhian grassroots leader. And she invariably is associated, one, as a Congress worker in her struggle against partition, in her struggle to retain Sylhet within Indian Dominion, and also in various programs of the Congress right from 1928 to 29 onwards. So she's born in 1915 at Sunamganj. Sunamganj is definitely Sunamganj subdivision in the Jagannathpur village of Sylhet. And probably friends would appreciate that when I talk about Sylhet, before 1947, I'm talking about Sylhet as part of Assam. So we are talking about, undivided India. We are talking about, colonial Assam when we are talking about Sylhet and Assam. So Suhasini Das is a lady who's born in 1915 at Sunamganj subdivision in the Jagannathpur village of Sylhet. And invariably, one sees that she begins to play a very, very active role in politics from 1930s onwards, late 1920s, early 1930s, where she joined the women's wing of the Congress at the Sheikh Ghat. These are locations which are in Sylhet. As I said, that I try to recover the grassroots narratives. And so if I'm trying to talk about the Sylhet referendum, the partition politics that essentially plays out in the southern districts of Assam, I'm invariably drawing your attention to the kind of politics and participation that actually plays out at the grassroots in colonial Assam. So between 1938, 39 and 1947, that's the location where, that's the time period where I locate this lady, a fiery lady, a lady who actually plays a signal role in the anti-colonial movement first, and then, and in Gandhian method. And what is very striking is that one of the things that we probably need to acknowledge, that the coming in of Mahatma Gandhi in the freedom struggle, in the anti-colonial movement, changed the dynamics of the anti-colonial struggle itself, because we see that a lot of marginal voices essentially get mainstreamed, and women participate in a huge number in this anti-colonial struggle. So Suhasini Das is one such lady who actually joins the women's wing of the Congress. And this women's wing is called the Mahila Sangha. In 1950, at a meeting of the Mahila Sangha, where she was led by leaders like Sarala Baladev. Now, the point is, here I want to essentially name a few ladies. The reason is very, very simple, that I think in our mainstream narratives, and I'm consciously talking about mainstream narratives, including Political History of Assam by H.K. Barpujari, or the other mainstream texts. Invariably, there is an attempt by scholarship to subvert the independent, autonomous position of women. So invariably, every time there is a reference to some lady who's very, very progressive, or a lady who actually plays a very, very active role in politics, or who's playing a leadership role in the Congress, she is invariably referred to as somebody's sister, somebody's wife, somebody's mother. So the point that I'm trying to mention here is that I want to refer to these ladies in their own right. I do not want to talk about them as somebody's mother or somebody's sister or somebody's daughter. And so that is invariably not the focus. But I want to also highlight women's solidarities that invariably help in the construction of the participation of these women in these anti-colonial movement. So in the sense, when I'm talking about Suhasini Das, I'm talking about her as a leader of the Mahila Sangha. Mahila Sangha is a women's organization, is a women's wing of the Congress in Sylhet. And as I said, Sylhet is in undivided Assam, it's in colonial Assam. And so therefore, it is definitely within the domain of Indian freedom movement. It is definitely within the domain of Indian anti-colonial struggle. So she is encouraged by her leader, Sarala Baladev. There were other leaders also who actually played a very, very important role in politics at that particular point of time. I can talk about Kalyani Lahiri, the sisters, Anjali Lahiri and Kalyani Lahiri. I can talk about Sandhya Lahiri Das. I can talk about Suhasini Das. I can talk about Hena Das. Now, these are women who are extremely important for understanding how grassroots mobilization essentially takes place, how grassroots mobilization essentially plays out in the context of colonial Assam, in the context of a period between 1930s and 1940s. So she attended this meeting in 1940 and took a vow, and she was encouraged by her leader. And this was a practice that, if you attended the Mahila Sangha and if you attended the conference, you have to take a vow, So, there are a lot of people, for example, Deshbandhu Chittaranjan Das, invariably, or Motilal Nehru, or even at some time Jawaharlal Nehru, took a vow, post 1929, 1930s, that they would forsake their foreign clothes, they would forsake their Western outfit and shift to Khadi. Now, this was a vow, So in that sense, even at the grassroots, and that's at the higher level, that's at the upper crust of the Congress leadership. Now, at the grassroots, you see that how women groups, women solidarities invariably help in constructing or implementing this kind of a policy or a program of the Congress. So Suhasini Das attends this meeting of the Mahila Sangha in 1940 and encouraged by her leader, the senior leaders, Sarala Baladev, Anjali Lahiri, Kalyani Das. Now, encouraged by the leaders, she took a vow to wear khadi. And not only that, and this is very, very important. Now, please also, it's also important to see how these grassroots leaders essentially helped to realize the aim of popularizing handloom and handicrafts. So she joined a handloom and handicraft school soon after. And after about 3 months, and she was so good that she actually joined in as an instructor. Within 3 months of her joining, she had perfected the arts of the handicraft school. And, as part of the Congress organization, she played a very, very important role in the Mahila Sangha. And one of his most, she was one of the most active members. And this is where we actually see her being, it's important to recover these names. For example, in the context of the Quit India movement of 1942, one name that invariably stands out is the name of Aruna Asaf Ali. We all know about Aruna Asaf Ali, a lady who invariably was at the forefront of the Quit India movement. We need to understand that on the 8th of August, 1942, almost the entire top rung of the Congress leaders were put in jail, were imprisoned. And it was left to the middle rung and the grassroots leadership of the Congress to implement the Congress program. In the context of, Sylhet, in the context of colonial Assam, we see that, considering that the top rung of the provincial and the central leadership were in jail, the burden, the responsibility, not burden, the responsibility of leading the movement of this Quit India movement invariably fell on these grassroots leaders. So Suhasini essentially joined the anti-colonial movement and led the movement and was also imprisoned. She was imprisoned. But in her narrative, and this invariably, when I went through this narrative of Suhasini Das, there is a personal dimension that I will share today with all of us here. Suhasini says that it was decided that there would be a hartal. And it was also decided that the government offices will be closed down. And there would be picketing of the courts. And the picketing would be that the judge would not be allowed to get into the courtroom to conduct his business of the day. And this is exactly what was implemented across Sylhet. I'm reminded of an elderly, she's probably the eldest and a very elderly lady whose name is Snehalata Deb. And, this lady, I had an opportunity to meet her when I was much younger. So probably I was not conscious enough to sit down and record her narratives. But I remember that, she tells me, and she was around 82 when I met her. I was definitely young. And she was a member of the Forward Bloc. She was very close to Netaji. And most importantly, she was known as Jojni, as in judge. And if it's a lady judge, then you use a suffix ni, as in Rani, so Jojni. So in that sense, I met this lady, and and even at that age, she was spectacular. And she told us that, as part of the conversation, that she actually, as part of the Quit India movement, she had actually picketed the Sylhet district judge's court, and she did not allow the district judge to get into the courtroom. And when he tried to enter the courtroom, pushed the judge away, and for that whole day, sat on the judge's chair and dispensed justice. Now, this was part of the Quit India movement program to subvert colonial bureaucracy, colonial judiciary. So I was really drawn in to this narrative of Suhasini Das, and who tells us hundreds of ladies joined this picketing. And it's important to acknowledge the role of ladies, because when it came to the ladies, organizing these movements, it was very difficult for the police to actually, forcefully evict them from their picketing spot. So therefore, the women played a very, very important role in Congress politics, especially in the time of the mass movements. When riots broke out, post 1945 elections, when riots broke out at Noakhali, Gandhi came down to Noakhali as part of his peace mission. And Suhasini joined Gandhi at Noakhali along with other volunteers of the Mahila Sangha. They organized camps to aid the riot displaced, fed them, and she, along with other co-workers, and she names her co-workers, Sarala Baladev, Bani Datta, Naresh Nandini Datta, and they work at Comilla. Now, it's important for us to also take into consideration that when we are talking about colonial India. So a large territory that I talk about, at least till the 15th of August, 1947, is invariably part of undivided India, is part of, colonial India. So invariably, these members of the Mahila Ashram, Mahila Sangha, were forced to move from Noakhali to Comilla, say Habiganj, to Brahmanbaria. Now these are parts of Tripura. If we actually go back to geography, if we go back to the map, we'd probably realize that this is part of Comilla, Brahmanbaria. These are part of colonial Tripura. These are part of Chakla Roshnabad, which is Plains Tripura. Invariably, as I said, one should not be guided by the geography that we see often now, because we are not talking about this geography, we are talking about the geography before 1947. So most of these communities, most of these territories are both hills and plains. So therefore, when I talk about Suhasini Das, she's invariably effortlessly moving from Noakhali. Noakhali is a district in East Bengal, to Comilla. Comilla is an adjacent district in the plains of Tripura. So she moves to Noakhali, from Noakhali to Comilla, and sets up what is called Abhay Ashram. Abhay means where you are given security. So invariably in the riot situation, these refugee camps, these places which were shelters for displaced people, these were run by the Mahila Sangha. And it is as part of the Mahila Sangha that Suhasini plays such a stellar role. She returned to Sylhet from Noakhali after 3 months and began to work with the riot-affected people in Habiganj. Now, Habiganj is in Sylhet, and which is adjacent to Comilla and Noakhali. And this is very, very important for us to remember that we are talking about a very fluid kind of a geography. We are not talking about partition. We are not talking about barbed wire fences. We are talking about a fluid geography where people are effortlessly moving from one province to the other, from one district to the other. And then when Sylhet moves into a referendum, and this is where I talk about Suhasini again, that when in 1947, when Lord Mountbatten, 3rd of June 1947, when Lord Mountbatten decides that India shall be partitioned and there shall be a referendum in Sylhet, Suhasini actually goes into a leadership role to essentially mobilize the women volunteers to campaign against partition. And that's why I think it's important to also appropriate these narratives into the anti-colonial movement, into the narratives of history, to talk about not just people who played their role in the dominant, anti-colonial narratives such as partition anti-partition agitations of 1905 or Quit India movement or non-cooperation movement or civil disobedience movement. These are mainstream narratives which most of the history texts will tell us. But I think it's important to also talk about narratives which incorporate struggles against partition, because that is as much, part of the anti-colonial struggle. Partition was part of colonial machinations, colonial decision that India should be divided on communal lines and communal antagonisms should continue and be institutionalized. So people who essentially struggled against this colonial, machination are as much part
Dr.
of the
Dutta,
anti-colonial struggle.
I will interrupt you just a bit. I think you need to move on to talk now a little bit about the Chakmas and Garos, otherwise we'll be running out of time.
Yes, ma'am. Yes. Ma'am, now I want to, that is insofar as the Sylhet referendum, the colonial Assam is concerned. I now want to draw your attention to the Garo situation. Now, one of the things that we probably, when we start imagining this Garo space, we invariably talk about Garo Hills. But we probably don't realize that the Garos are actually transboundary, transborder community. And if one goes back to Playfair, an ethnographic work on the Garo, the Playfair's book, the Garos actually, it's not the Garo, the Garos. Playfair very, very clearly points out that he's not just talking about the Garo Hills per se, but he's talking about other Garos as well, who are located, even in Gwalpara. Gwalpara is definitely part of another district of Assam. And also the Bengali district. Bengali means as in Bengal, East Bengal, not as in Bengali speaking, but East Bengal district of Mymensingh. So invariably, we are talking about, if one looks at the census, the Bengal census invariably gives us an idea about the Garos located in Mymensingh. And in the context of the Assam census of 1931 and 1941, they give us an idea of the Garo in what is called Garo Hills and Gwalpara. So if one goes into the census category, the Garos are actually enumerated as located both in Garo Hills and Gwalpara. So invariably, we are talking about geographies which today might seem absolutely spaced out and delineated and absolutely bordered. But in the context of a pre-1947 period, I don't think that it would be historically correct to talk about this kind of a division. I just want to flag two things that in 1931 and 1941 census, by 1941 census, we actually see that the Garos, in Garo Hills and Gwalpara would be around 226,273. So it's 226,273 in Garo Hills and Gwalpara. And you have another 100,000 in the plains of Mymensingh. So we are basically looking at around about 330,000 Garos who are spread across this geography. The reason why I highlight this geography, ma'am, is because we probably have heard so much about, Sonaram Sangma. We've heard so much about Togan Sangma. When we are trying to talk in terms of, the Garo participation in the anti-colonial movement or in the freedom struggle, I think it's also important to highlight another person who's otherwise not, acknowledged, except in terms of the oral narratives of the Plains Garos. And the person that I'm talking about is a person by the name of Mikat Sangma. And I hope that we are in a position to recover the history of this gentleman. Only thing is, contrary to Suhasini Das, where her birth year actually is very clearly mentioned. I mentioned 1915 as the year of her birth. In the case of Mikat Sangma, no such records are available. But what is available is that he actually, was successful in obtaining a law degree from the Calcutta University. And this is very, very important. So in that sense, he was actually a law graduate from Calcutta University before 1947. And after obtaining his, he was a practicing Christian. But after obtaining his law degree, and when he came back to the Plains Garo areas, he declared himself to be the chief of undivided Garo region. Now, this is very, very important, because when he declared himself to be a chief of this undivided Garo region, both north, which is Garo Hills, and south, which is Plains, which is in the Mymensingh region, the colonial, state was extremely worried. And official notings invariably say that he, probably tried to mobilize the indigenous communities who were also part of indigenous faith. And the official noting says he forsook his master's ethical path. This is the note that is there in his, along with his, name. And this is also reflected in this narrative of various people who have worked, colonial and Western scholars who have worked. They have invariably reproduced this line from the archive. That is, this gentleman, when he comes back to the Garo Hills, decides to give up, his faith and take up the indigenous faith and start mobilizing the community, and declares himself to be a chief. A Garo chief. And, when partition happened, when partition proposals are, made public, he actually organizes a rebellion, a resistance against partition. And this is very, very important, because what he does is that he actually carries out this movement and armed attacks against the colonial state, because he feels that by launching an armed attack, he could subvert the colonial machinations of partitioning the Garos. Now, one of the things that we probably need to, remember, that right across, the colonial archives, and right from 1947, when the Boundary Commission was established with Sir Cyril Ratcliffe as the chairman of the Boundary Commission, if one were to actually, go back to the report of the Boundary Commission, ma'am, I want to read out a small paragraph, with your permission, of that Boundary Commission report. And it says, and this is what Cyril Ratcliffe is reporting to Lord Mountbatten: in my view, the question, which means the question of partition, is limited to the district of Sylhet and Kachar, since the other districts of Assam that can be said to adjoin Sylhet, neither the Garo Hills, nor the Khasi and Jaintia Hills, nor the Lushai Hills have anything approaching a Muslim majority. So basically, the point that that Cyril Ratcliffe and Lord Mountbatten was saying, that the only people who would be affected by the partition of 1947 would be the Hindus and the Muslims of Sylhet, while the other communities who actually also shared the space, and this is where we need to understand that Sylhet was, and in fact, it was a fluid space, and it's not a space that was only Hindus and Muslims. It was also a space of indigenous communities. And this is something that gets subverted officially in 1947. And it is in this subversion, it is against this subversion, colonial subversion, that we see Mikat Sangma. And he says that he actually launched a movement, he launched an armed attack, he launched a political role. He advocated that the Pakistan frontier, and when he realized that the borders would be drawn, he argued that the boundary should actually be shifted at least by 30 miles, so that the Plains Garos would also be brought within the domain of India. So I think when we are trying to talk in terms of the anti-colonial struggle and we are talking about freedom movement, I think, ma'am, we also need to incorporate voices like these, who not only launched a resistance against the colonial, launched a movement, a political struggle against colonial machinations, but they also actually had an active role in trying, at least trying, to secure the fate of the community in light of the dangers that partition of India posed to these communities. So invariably, all these communities were actually divided, cut across, were almost sliced across two nations, India and Pakistan. And we know that for example, the Khasi and the Jaintia, the War Khasi areas, the War Khasi people invariably lost huge tracts of land in Sylhet. Similarly, Jaintias, the War Jaintia areas, the Jaintiapur, which is basically the capital of, the Jaintia, the winter capital of the Jaintias. Now that is in Sylhet. So invariably, these territories were sliced right through. So communities were divided. They were divided between kinsmen. And this is, Mikat Sangma is this person who actually launched almost an armed struggle against this division of the community. Ma'am, I want to also flag a third case. And this third case is the case of the Chakmas. Now, when we talk about this anti-colonial movement, we see that the Chakmas were as much part of the larger anti-colonial movement, both before 1947, and were as much affected by partition in 1947. And so therefore, this person that I'm talking about is this person by the name of Sneha Kumar Chakma. Sneha Kumar Chakma, he's a political leader, and he was a very, very active member of the Constituent Assembly of India before 1947 as well. So he was born in a village near Rangamati. Now, Rangamati is the capital of the Chittagong hill tracts. And he was born in a village, Khabong Pajya. That is the name of his village in 1914. So he's almost contemporary to Suhasini Das. So these are people who are almost contemporary. He was, as a student, he actually was involved in political activity. And because in 1939, ma'am, one of the things that we probably should also remember, that to quell the participation of students in the political movements launched by Mahatma Gandhi, the government of India, especially government of Assam, issued what is called the Cunningham Circular. And similar circulars were also issued in other parts of Eastern India, which forbade students from participating in the anti-colonial movement. And this particular person, Sneha Kumar Chakma, invariably became part of that movement against the Cunningham Circular. And he encouraged his mother to actually participate in the Congress programs. And in his biography, in his autobiography, not biography, in his autobiography, he actually writes that when I came to know of the Lahore Congress session decision that they should encourage khadi, I induced my mother to participate in the Congress exhibition. And as a result, he says two things. One, my mother sent an 18-inch square hand-spun, hand-woven khadi to the exhibition and won the second prize. This made me love everything Swadeshi. Now, this is one part of the story. The other part of the story is that when he was discovered, he was identified as a ringleader, and he was rusticated from school. Initially, he was rusticated. Subsequently, that rustication order was taken back, and but he was sent to jail. And that was the year where he was about to give his matriculation examination, the class 10 examinations. So he was then rusticated for 2 months. And you can imagine how difficult it would be for a student to be rusticated on the year that the person is actually sitting down and appearing for his class 10 examinations. So he moved the education department and he arranged for his matriculation examination in the subsequent year, 1933. And he was again arrested on some pretext or the other. So this process continued. And he writes that he was very, very closely associated, when he was in jail and in the period thereafter, he was very closely associated with the ideas of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. This is something that becomes very, very interesting. This is something probably we need to explore. How Sneha Kumar Chakma in Chittagong Hill Tracks becomes very, very close to Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. And he says, I came in close political connection with Subhash Chandra Bose, which continued up to his arrival at Kohima with the Azad Hind Force. Now, this is part of his autobiography. And I think I go back to what Geraldine Forbes had said in a very different context, that she, of course, had said that writing the history of women in India would be impossible unless we begin to search for, unearth, and preserve women's documents. Now, in this context, I think rewriting the history of these freedom fighters would probably not be as fruitful unless we recover these autobiographies or these narratives or interviews that they might have given to different people over a different period of time. So I think, ma'am, this is one, the last, I think, I'll just take 2 more minutes, ma'am, and then I'll close off the presentation. I want to invariably point out that Sneha Kumar Chakma is a very, very important leader in India's anti-colonial movement, not because that he espoused the case of the Chakmas only, but because of the fact that apart from his contribution, his participation in the freedom struggle against these circulars which tried to prohibit the participation of students in political activities, against in encouraging Swadeshi, handicrafts, handloom, basically the Swadeshi philosophy of the Congress. He also was important because that at least till 1947, the Chakmas were convinced, and so was the Congress leadership, that the Chakma and the Chittagong Hill Tracts would be definitely part of India. So invariably, he actually became co-opted in the Constituent Assembly subcommittee on the excluded areas, excluded areas committee. Now, this is very, very important because it also shows that this is one person who was also a participant in the Indian constitution making process. As we know that the 5th and the 6th schedule essentially emerged out of the deliberations of these excluded areas subcommittee of the Constituent Assembly. So invariably, we see Sneha Kumar Chakma playing a very, very important role in not only the anti-colonial movement, but also in the kind of making of post-colonial India by participating in the Constituent Assembly deliberations. He was co-opted as a member because he was part of the Chittagong Hill Tracts. He was part of the Chakma community, the indigenous community of the Chittagong Hill Tracts. He was, when partition was actually announced, he launched an all-out movement against partition and launched what is called the Chittagong Hill Tracts People's Association. Sneha Kumar Chakma was the general secretary of that association. And in that capacity, he launched a movement against the decision of the colonial state to make Chittagong Hill Tracts a part of Pakistan. We can probably, in a subsequent time, move on to the details of how he participated, the kind of correspondence that he had with people like, Nehru, people like Patel, people like Benigal Narsingh Rao, who was the constitutional advisor for the drafting of the constitution. And the point is that unless we incorporate these grassroots narratives into our historical scheme, probably we would not be able to construct a comprehensive history of the Indian independence movement. I think one of the biggest problems of this last 75 years, if I may very humbly point that out, is the fact that we have invariably made it top heavy. We have invariably emphasized mainstream and dominant organizations. We have invariably emphasized the role of the dominant leadership. We talk about, undoubtedly, we should be talking about Mahatma Gandhi, we should be talking about Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, we should be talking about Patel, we should be talking about Maulana Azad, we should be talking about Aruna Asaf Ali. But that is at the central level. But at the grassroots, how does the movement against the colonial gather traction? How does it actually gather momentum? I'm sure it would not be too far-fetched to submit that probably Indian freedom struggle is as much the story of the people at the top as it is as the story of the grassroots. So unless we recover the grassroots narratives, it would not be a comprehensive study. So probably taking advantage of this Azadi Ki Amrit Mahotsav, we can actually start the process of turning around this inverted pyramid, of trying to talk about how we can recover these grassroots narratives and prepare a comprehensive study. I'm really grateful to you, ma'am, for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts. I'm thankful to ICSSR. Thanks to Sir, Professor Bhagirathi Panda for giving me this opportunity. And I hope that I could make a small attempt at trying to argue that we need to recover grassroots voices in this celebrations of 75 years. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Dutta. That was a pretty comprehensive discussion. And I think you really covered the topic, what you had set out to do, to recover, or at least to bring to the notice of as many people as possible about the marginal. You know, people like Suhasini Das, for example, or Mikat Sangma, whom I've not heard about before today, you know, or for that matter, Sneha Kumar Chakma. So I'm glad that you started off by talking about the 75 years of independence and partition, bringing those two together. But before I, continue with what I'm about to say, I think I'll just see if there's anyone who would like to ask you some questions or would like some clarification. Is there anybody who have joined us that would like to make a comment or address Dr. Dutta in any way? Anybody? Okay, there's nothing on the chat. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So,
Yes.
oh yes. Dr. Gurung, go ahead, Professor Gurung.
Yes. I couldn't hear right from the beginning, but yeah, congratulations, Dr. Dutta. As Professor Maulong also said, there are some few people I was not aware about, the Garo especially, Mikat Sangma. Yeah, and so I'm thankful to you for the information and of course about Suhasini Das. Now, you are very right. Actually, it's just an observation, not even a question also. You are very right when you say that, if I remember this a long time back, Amalindu Guha, one of our very greatest Marxist historian from the region, Guha had referred long time back about the importance of incorporating what he called, of course, there's this big nationalism, and then he talked about the little nationalism or the little anti-colonial movement. So in that context, I feel, like your lecture, that you have a sort of, provided, okay, materials, information to indicate that besides the larger nationalism, this little nationalism also played a very, very important role, in fact, in strengthening the larger nationalism, the greater nationalism. So I will take your lecture in that sense. And certainly we need to highlight the role of all these people who have not been highlighted, as you said, though their roles are very, very important in the anti-colonial movement. So basically, I would just like to know what was this class background of these people, just to get a sense of from which background did they come? Because if you talk about Sneha Kumar Chakma, then and they're educated people, even Mikat Sangma. So perhaps what was the economic background? What was the class background? Just briefly. And about Suhasini Das, I would just like to know what happened to her in the end. I mean, did she move from Sylhet to come to go out of Sylhet after partition, or did she stay there? About her later life? Thank you.
Ma'am, may I answer?
Yes, please go ahead.
Ma'am, thank you so much first for your observations. Actually, validating the point that I was arguing, that, it's important to recover the voice of the grassroots, to recover the narratives of the grassroots, to recover the participation of the grassroots. Because unless you recovered the grassroots narratives, we probably would not be able to understand how this process of nationalism.
I'm sorry to interrupt. No more lecture within a lecture. You please answer her question if you don't mind. We're a little short of time. Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Insofar as then the question that is asked is specifically related to Suhasini Das, whether she migrated to India or she continued to stay back in Sylhet. In the case of Suhasini Das, she continued to stay back in Sylhet. She is one person who did not migrate to India. She stayed on, and they actually set up an ashram. It's called Vidyashram. The ashram still exists in Sylhet. It's in a place called Kulaura. Kulaura is a junction. It's a railway junction that was in operation in the colonial period, was discontinued after. It's still a junction in Sylhet, but it used to connect the Bengal with Northeast India. So that ashram is based in Kulaura. So she continued to be there. She did not migrate, ma'am. And she continued with her Gandhian principles and continued as Gandhian leader there. Thank you so much.
The second question was on the background.
Oh, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. All these people that we are talking about invariably came from middle-class backgrounds. And as it is evident that while they might have initially started off from difficult economic conditions, I will specifically cite the case of Sneha Kumar Chakma. He writes in his autobiography as well about his background. But all the three, for Mikat Sangma, we do not know exactly the background, but the fact that he could actually go to Calcutta and be part of Calcutta University and study law, it's quite an expensive process, ma'am, to study, to acquire legal education, even in those times. Reflects the fact that they essentially came from middle-class backgrounds. Suhasini also came from middle-class backgrounds. Not very, very educated in the modern education sense, but people who had hands-on education. So therefore, as part of the Mahila Sangha, she was definitely was part of a middle-class background. This was a middle-class organization. Sneha Kumar Chakma, and the answer for Sneha Kumar Chakma, this is what he writes in his autobiography. He says, my father Shamchandra was a poor agriculturist on 2-acre paddy land and a private tutor of the Chakma script. He had no school education. I was the strong will of my mother Mankumari that made my way for little modern education. So basically, the point that is there is that they came from difficult economic backgrounds, but they were from the middle class. the social force that they essentially came from, they constituted the middle class.
Thank you, Dr. Dutta. I think
Thank
that
you.
answers
Thank you.
Professor Gurung's question. I've typed in, is there any other question? But nobody has replied yet. And if there isn't any, I think we'll wind up. So I would once again thank Dr. Dutta for bringing up this whole issue of 75 years of independence and linking it with partition, reminding everyone about that, because that's extremely important, because the experiences of the people that you've been talking about, is closely linked with this whole issue of participation. And what you have also said as a negation of a composite culture. And this is something that we really need to work on. Why is it that, that even people from the region itself, as Professor Gurung brought, suggested, and I have also said that even we from here have not heard of certain individuals like Mikat Sangma, Sneha Kumar Chakma, for that matter. Suhasini, I've heard from you. You've, discussed that issue with me before. So I've heard of that again from you. So even we from the region, we don't know enough about these so-called smaller voices, or the unheard experiences, the experiences of these groups of people, of the marginal. So to a large extent, we can say that mainstream historians have not taken into account the history, the struggles of the peripheral, but the peripheral also must empower themselves by taking charge, taking control, by doing something more about it. And to that extent, I must say that the government's initiative of this Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav has been extremely wonderful. And, it has really sort of brought it again center stage, this whole issue, and sort of drawn all of us in to take charge and take control, that we also got to do something about it, to bring it out in the open, to talk about it, to have the kind of webinar that we're having right now, etc., so that we inform ourselves. People from the region can be informed, and then we can talk about, people from outside of the region also being informed. And in particular, focusing on the indigenous, focusing on women's participation. I think that is extremely, extremely important. Undoubtedly, they would come from the middle classes. The leadership roles would emanate from these groups, naturally. These are the people that understand the importance of, the movement itself, and they would be able to organize and that sort of thing. So this has been a very, very interesting discussion. And as Professor Gurung said, and it was something that also went through my mind, when we talk of mainstream like this big river, powerful river, but for it to really gain strength, it needs these feeders, these small streams from all over that will also go and become part of that river. So I only hope that in the series of lectures that is envisaged by the honorary director of the ICSSR, in connection with the Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, hopefully this will be a step in the right direction, to inform all of us, to be better informed about the kinds of works, the kinds of participation that has been there, the experiences of individuals, and how much they can reflect the experiences of the whole of the societies they represent, because their experiences probably was shared by members of their society as well. So that gives us a sense of participation and so on and so forth. And I suppose will be a very, very important binding factor, of the of Indianness, if you like, how everyone participated, including people, communities from the Northeast, from the so-called peripheral areas. I thank everyone who have spared their time to be with us this morning and afternoon. And I especially thank our speaker for today, Dr. Dutta. And I also thank our honorary director, Professor Panda, for putting together this series of lectures. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Just few words from my side, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am, agreeing and so beautifully and moderating this session. My thanks also goes to Binayak for so wonderfully, I think, bringing up the unknowns and their words and their contribution to Indian freedom struggle, particularly against the colonial power. And the last sentence of his lecture, I think really was when influenced me. And when he says, the story of Indian freedom struggle is not the story of the mainstream, freedom fighters. It's a story of freedom fighters at the margin. So I think that's where actually I think we have not done the justice. And as you rightly said, under this Azadi Ki Amrit Mahotsav, if we can, I think, bring them and then document their words, their contribution, I think that would be a great contribution to this celebration, and then to make the Indian history a comprehensive, the Indian history of freedom struggle a comprehensive one, as he said. This reminds me 2-3 lines, ma'am. I think Binayak also. I think Thomas Gray has written a long time back that full many gems of purest treasure in the dark unfathomed caves of the ocean bear. Full many flowers are born and waste unseen in the desert air. So just like actually, I think we have so many gems. They are all beneath the sea, and no one knows. I think their worth. So like that, there are beautiful flowers with all kinds of fragrance in the desert, but they just get dissipated and they just lost without the world knowing their fragrance and their contribution. So it's exactly that the exercise that Dr. Datta and many of you in your departments are doing. It's all finding out these gems and their contributions. And from ICSSR side, ma'am, it's my commitment that let's come together, partner with, and try to, I think, document to the extent possible the works of these unsung heroes who have so, I think, so intensely contributed to the freedom struggle. And one proposal which we have already discussed, I think we can think about it and we should have it, is that actually we can bring out a special issue of our journal, Man and Society, particularly devoting to documenting the works and any kind of research relating to these unsung heroes. And I would request Dr. Datta, yourself, I think Professor Gurum is also here. It was wonderful to listen to her here itself in this online interaction, that all of you and other colleagues of your departments, and even from the Northeast also, you know better than me, who are working in these kind of areas. And that would be a very significant contribution of you people, I mean to say your department, to the region and to the country, and even beyond, I mean to say. When you talk about integrating with artists, I threw this artist policy with Southeast Asia and East Asia. So an important component, it's not only about economic integration as it's being highlighted. Of course, economics matters, but this kind of interaction, these are missing, very important missing dots when it comes to, I think, working as freedom fighters. And it's not simply working as freedom fighters, it's also that themselves are institutions, as Binayak has said. So I think all the three of them that Binayak has talked about, Suhasini, then Mikat Sangma, then Sneha Kumar Chakma, at that point of time, when you contextualize them to the times of their own, they themselves were institutions. They have become institutions in their own, right. So we need to unravel more, not only about the individuals, the institutions that they have left behind and they did. So I think with these words, I once again thank Binayak for that wonderful lecture. And then Professor Maulang for so nicely, I think, moderating this one. Although we had very thin attendance this time, next time when we have it, we'll see that I think we time it such a manner that we have larger participation. I thank also Professor, I think, Guru. She could come and she could join and also reflect upon the kind of deliberation that Binayak was having, and also thank a lot others who have joined online in this interaction. Thank you, each one of you. We look forward to all of you to have more such events, more such interactions in days to come, so that ultimately, I would say the repository of knowledge, particularly on this very field, and the repository of knowledge in social sciences in this part of the country becomes, I think, a treasure, a very enriched treasure in days to come, which you can leave it for our posterity, which will put actually, I think, the very idea and practice of people of this part of the country and their contribution to nation making, nation building in days to come. So with these words, I thank each one of you.
Thank you so much.
And it was a pleasure to have all of you here itself. And we look forward to have more meaningful interactions days to come. Thank you all.